was not famous. She had made sure of that. But once, when she was 7 years old, her name had been read aloud on every television network in the country, and she had spent the rest of her life trying to make people forget it. The world remembered her father. Few remembered her. The house on Larkspur Lane was the kind of house people photographed from a street: white columns, a circular driveway, a fountain that never quite worked right. Marcus Voss had bought it after his second championship season, back when sports writers still called him the Cannon, and children wore his jersey number to school. His wife, Elena, had filled it with orchids she cooked like pets and dinner parties that ran past midnight. Naomi was 7. Her brother, Theo, was 5. On the night everything split into a before and an after, they were asleep in the room at the end of the hall, the one with the nightlight shaped like a half-moon. She would tell a therapist many years later that she remembered 3 things clearly: the sound of a door slamming that was too hard to be the wind, a single cry that cut off in the middle, and then a silence so complete that she could hear her own heartbeat in her ears. She did not remember getting out of bed. She did not remember what she saw in the hallway, only that afterward there was a color she could not look at for years, a deep, wet red, and that she flinched at it in paint swatches, in sunsets, in the trim of a stranger's coat, for the rest of her childhood. The police came before dawn. Neighbors stood on their lawns in bathrobes. By the time the sun was fully up, there were vans with satellite dishes parked along the whole length of Larkspur Lane, and a woman in a blazer was already saying Elena Voss's name into a microphone as though it belonged to everyone now, not just to her children. Naomi remembered being carried out of the house wrapped in a blanket that smelled like someone else's laundry detergent, not her own. She remembered a female officer crouching in front of her on the front steps, asking if she was cold, and Naomi answering yes, though she wasn't sure that was true. She remembered noticing, with a strange sideways clarity that children sometimes have in moments too large for them, that the officer's radio kept crackling with a voice saying numbers over and over, and that nobody seemed to be listening to the numbers at all. Theo, only 5, cried for their mother in the car on the way to their aunt's house, and Naomi did not correct him, did not tell him what she suspected, because some small, overwhelmed part of her had already decided that if she said it out loud, it would become true in a way it was not yet allowed to be. Marcus Voss was arrested 9 days later, on a Friday, in a scene that would replay on television so many times over the following year that strangers could describe it to Naomi's face before she was old enough to understand what a fair trial was supposed to mean. She and Theo were kept at their aunt's house that week, the shades drawn, a police officer they didn't know sitting in a car outside for reasons no one explained to them. Their aunt, a nervous woman named Priscilla, who had never had children of her own, tried to keep them occupied with cartoons and coloring books. But Naomi noticed that every time the television was on, Priscilla sat close to the remote, ready to change the channel the instant a certain kind of music started, the kind that meant a news anchor was about to speak. Nobody sat the children down and asked them what they had heard. There was talk later of a detective who wanted to. There was more talk, immediately after, of lawyers who said no. Naomi was 7. The system decided, without ever quite deciding out loud, that whatever was inside her could stay inside her. She did tell someone eventually, but not for years, and not in a police station. It happened first in a therapist's office when she was 11, in a version so halting and fragmented that the therapist wrote in her notes only that the child described sensory memories consistent with having been near a violent event, and did not push further, because pushing further, in that era, was not yet understood to be safe. Naomi drew, in that same session, 2 houses on a single piece of paper, one bright with yellow crayon windows, the other dark, with a smear of red crayon dragged sideways across the door, as though her hand had moved faster than her permission to draw it. The therapist kept the drawing in a file that Naomi would not see again until she requested her own childhood records at the age of 36. The trial began the following spring and lasted 9 months. It became, by some measures, the most watched legal proceeding in the country's history. Strangers organized their lunch breaks around it. Comedians built entire acts on it. A man in Ohio was fired from his job for watching the verdict on a store television instead of restocking shelves, and the story of his firing became its own minor headline, a joke nested inside the larger tragedy. Naomi and Theo were sent to live with their maternal grandmother, a quiet, precise woman named Ruth Alvarez, who had buried her daughter and now found herself, at 68, raising 2 children who flinched at loud noises and refused, for reasons she didn't fully understand, to sit anywhere in the house with their backs to a door. Ruth kept them away from newspapers. She unplugged the television during the dinner hour. But it did not matter. Other children's parents talked. Teachers whispered in the hallway, just loud enough to be heard. A boy in Naomi's class once acted out the crime during recess, using a jump rope until a teacher pulled him away, and Naomi went home that day and did not speak for 2 full days afterward. Ruth wrote about it briefly in a journal she kept during those years, a journal that Naomi would not read until she was 39 years old and finally ready to. Ruth's journal, when Naomi did finally read it, described a household organized entirely around avoidance. Ruth wrote about removing the newspaper from the driveway before the children woke. She wrote about a school administrator who called unprompted to say that a parent had complained about Naomi's attitude problem, and how Ruth had hung up the phone and sat at the kitchen table for 20 minutes before she trusted herself to speak to anyone. She wrote more than once about her own guilt, the sense that in protecting the children from the noise of the case, she might also have been failing to give them any language at all for what they'd survived. "I don't know if silence is armor or if it's just another kind of wound," Ruth wrote, in an entry dated the autumn after the trial began. "I only know I don't have anything better to offer them right now." The trial itself unfolded over 9 months, and even in Ruth's careful newspaper-free household, it found its way in. A classmate's older sibling had a poster in her bedroom mocking the case. A cashier at the grocery store once looked twice at Naomi's last name on a school permission slip Ruth was signing, and asked, in a voice that clearly thought it was being discreet, "Any relation?" Ruth answered with a flat, practiced no, and steered Naomi out of the store before the woman could say another word. The verdict, when it came, split the country almost exactly in half. Marcus Voss was acquitted. Somewhere, people celebrated in the streets. Somewhere else, people wept in their kitchens. For Naomi, then 8 years old, there was only a single unbearable fact underneath all of it. Her mother was still gone, and the man who used to carry her on his shoulders at the county fair was, as far as the law was concerned, not the reason why. She did not fully understand the word acquitted that day. She asked Ruth what it meant, and Ruth, who had spent the entire 9 months trying to find language soft enough for an 8-year-old and honest enough to still be true, finally said only, "It means the court didn't decide he did it. It doesn't mean the court decided he didn't." Naomi carried that sentence with her for the rest of her life, turning it over so many times across so many years that by the time she was an adult, she could no longer remember whether it was wisdom or evasion, only that it was the truest thing anyone had managed to say to her that whole year. Ruth moved the children 2 states away the following year. She changed their routines, enrolled them under a slightly altered spelling of their last name, and made a habit of telling new neighbors only that she was raising her grandchildren because their mother passed. It was true, and it was also a wall, and Ruth built it carefully, one polite half-truth at a time. Naomi grew into a watchful, precise child, then a watchful, precise teenager. She got excellent grades. She kept a small circle of friends and never let any of them come to the house. She developed a habit, which lasted into adulthood, of sitting facing the entrance in any restaurant, and of flinching almost imperceptibly at the sound of a door closing too hard. In high school, a guidance counselor once asked her, gently, why she never talked about her family. Naomi told her there's nothing to talk about, and the counselor, sensing a door she had no right to open, let it go. It was, Naomi would say decades later, one of the few kindnesses of that era, the not asking. She studied psychology in college, then went further into a graduate program focused on childhood trauma and the long-term effects of high-profile family violence on surviving children. She never used her own story in her published work, not once, though colleagues who knew her personal history would say, quietly, that every paper she wrote seemed to circle the same wound from a slightly different angle, like a hand tracing the outline of a scar without ever touching it directly. Her graduate thesis, in particular, examined how children who survive a parent's public trial develop what one of her professors called anticipatory privacy, a lifelong, almost reflexive instinct to withhold personal information before anyone has even asked for it. built from years of having strangers assume they were entitled to details that were never theirs to have. Naomi never told her thesis committee that she was, in effect, writing her own case study under a borrowed set of statistics. Only one professor, a soft-spoken man near retirement who had followed the original case decades earlier, ever asked her directly if the subject matter was personal. She told him everyone in this field has a reason for being in it, and he did not ask again, though he wrote her the strongest recommendation letter of her academic career. College gave her something she hadn't expected, a version of normal life, however partial. She joined no organizations that required a photograph or a public roster. She kept a small, tightly vetted circle of friends, and set boundaries with a precision that some of them found strange until they came to understand, slowly and without ever being told outright, that the boundaries were the price of her friendship, not an obstacle to it. She never brought anyone to Ruth's house. She never explained why. After graduation, she spent 14 months working as a caseworker for a nonprofit that supported children who had witnessed domestic violence, a job she took, she would say later, because I finally understood what those kids needed better than most people who trained for it. A supervisor from that period, interviewed years afterward for an internal newsletter profile that never mentioned Naomi's surname, described her as quietly the best caseworker I ever worked with, the kind who never needed to be told twice what a child wasn't ready to say out loud yet. It was during those 14 months that Naomi began keeping private notes of her own, late at night, in a spiral notebook she kept in a locked drawer. Some were addressed to her mother. Some were addressed to no one. One entry, written the night after a client session that had gone unexpectedly close to her own history, read simply, "I was taught to love him. I don't remember being taught to be afraid of him. I just remember being afraid of him, before anyone taught me anything at all." She did not date seriously until her late 20s. When she finally did, she told her partner exactly one rule on their third date. Her father's name was never to be said in her home. He kept that rule for the 11 years they were together, and never once asked her to explain it further than she wanted to. Years later, after they parted on amicable terms, he would say the thing he respected most about those 11 years was that she never once made him guess where the line was. She simply told him, once clearly, and trusted him to honor it. Marcus Voss's life after the trial did not go quietly, even though his daughters did. He wrote a memoir that no publisher wanted to touch, then a second one that a smaller press did, full of chapters that danced right up to the edge of confession and then veered away from it, sentence by sentence, in a way that infuriated the people who wanted a clean answer and satisfied no one at all. He gave interviews sporadically, always to outlets willing to pay, always framed as his side of the story, and every single time one aired, Naomi's phone would ring with reporters, hoping she might finally respond on camera. She never did. He was arrested again years later, this time for an armed robbery attempt so strange and so public, an attempt to reclaim what he insisted were his own memorabilia items from a hotel room, at gunpoint in front of witnesses, that even people who had defended him fiercely during the murder trial called it baffling. He served 6 years. Naomi read about the sentencing in a 2-line wire report a coworker left open on a shared computer, and she remembered feeling almost nothing, which frightened her more than feeling something would have. Naomi did not visit him in prison. She did not write. When reporters occasionally tracked her down, and they did every few years, usually around an anniversary of a case, her answer, delivered through a lawyer, was always the same 4 words, "I have no comment." She kept a folder, for a while, of every request that came in, not because she intended to respond to any of them, but because seeing the volume of them written down somewhere, contained in a single folder, made them feel smaller than they did rattling around loose in her mind. There was one exception. In the spring of a year she would later describe only as the year I finally let myself look at it. A cousin, one of the few relatives who had maintained any contact with Marcus at all, arranged a meeting, the first in over a decade, at a diner 2 hours from where Marcus was living out his parole. Naomi went. She did not tell Ruth she was going, and she never fully explained afterward why she'd agreed, except to say, once, to a close friend, "I think I needed to know if he still looked like someone who could have done it. I don't know what I expected that to prove. I just needed to look." He was older than she expected, smaller than the man from the highlight reels and the courtroom sketches, a shrunken, careful version of the man who used to fill a doorway. He ordered coffee he barely touched. He asked about Theo, about her work, in a tone so ordinary it was almost obscene given everything sitting unspoken between them. Near the end of the meal, he slid a paperback across the table to her, his second memoir, and said, "You should read this. You'll understand me better."